Hello everyone, my name is Greg and I dev stuff. Welcome everyone to episode 9 of the tactics game in Unity. In this episode we will implement selecting the character. Okay, before we continue, in the updated asset you will find a new model for the enemy. So let's redo the character. Good. Sorry for constant updates to the models. It is work in progress, so we have to redo it sometimes. I'm terribly sorry about this. Now let's drop the skeleton dude on the scene, which is our new model. We need to make a material for this skeleton dude. Then assign this material to all his parts, except for the arrow. Arrow material parts are in the weapon folder. With bunch of weapons for us to use in the game in the future. All thanks to Declan Mohan and his generous support of this project. This skeleton dude have a collection of new actions. It is all related to spear. So now we can implement the spear actions. And because they are using the same rig with the sword woman, those animations will work on her too. Which we will use later on to make an ability to arm same character with multiple types of weapons. So now let's add the spear animation to the skeleton. So add spear, idle, attack and run to the character. Add a parameter for move and attack. And connect all these animation states between each other. Similar how we did the sword woman. Now let's parent the spear to the character sword bone. We will need to rename this bone into something more correct, like weapon bone. Create and attach the material to the spear. And let's test this. We forgot to loop the animations. Good. Now we want to convert our skeleton model into the actual character of the scene. Remember that the model inside the character object is just a visual part. The character object itself is the actual game object, which will be interacting with the world and systems, while the skeleton model or sword woman model is just here for visualizing. So from the game object prefab folder, pull and place character object. If there will be a sword woman parented to this character object, delete her, and delete her from the character prefab itself. By opening the prefab by double clicking on the prefab object in the project window. And let's prefab the skeleton dude into character folder. Just his model. Check the sword woman. In my case, I messed up the saved prefab of the sword woman. Delete this prefab and create a new one specific for the sword woman model. That broke my character on the scene. From now on, to build the character, you just simply drop the character object on the scene and parent the model of the character from the character folder. Rename the character and assign the target grid. Good. This episode is brought to you by generous support of people on Patreon and members on YouTube. If you want to join them, link to my Patreon in the description, and join button available right now on YouTube. Now we want to make it possible to select the character on the scene by clicking on the node with the character. Select camera and let's disable the grid control component and move character component. Open grid control script. We will repurpose this script to use for selecting the objects on the scene. So let's remove all the parts about pathfinding out of this script. Good. Now what we want to do is to get the grid object in the position our mouse currently over. This part of the code does exactly this. It shoots the ray out of the mouse position on the screen, then it takes the point of intersection of this ray, called hit.point, which then converted into position on the grid. And then we use this grid position to get the grid object from the grid in that position. What we want to do now is to move this part out of the get mouse button down, so all this will be happening every frame. Create serialized field called hovering over and assign it in the update. Let's test this. Enable the grid control and launch the game. Notice how hovering over field change the state when you are hovering over the nodes on the grid with objects in them. Good. Now what we want to do is to add a new component to the character prefab called selectable grid object. This component should be present on any grid object which you want to make possible to select. So far we only have character and they should be possible to select. Later on we might introduce new grid objects which may end up impossible to be selected by the player. For example, items on the ground, while being grid object, will not be possible to select by the player. Or maybe in your game you will want to make it possible to select item on the ground, and in that case you will have to just add this component to the object. So now we want to select the object, open grid control, and in the get mouse button down, store the selectable grid object into a new field. If we are not hovering over any object, we shouldn't be able to select anything, so just add exit gate here. And let's test this. Now if I hover over the character and press left mouse button, it will select the character into selected object field. Good. And let's hypothetically say that one of the characters doesn't have selectable grid object, for whatever reason. Now if I try to click on that object, it will select nothing. But right now, no matter what I do, I can't deselect the character. To nullify the selection, let's use right mouse button, and if it is pressed, nullify selection. Good. Now let's polish our code a little. Let's extract all this code into separate methods with self-descriptive names. One more touch before we conclude this episode. In the hover over object check, this part will always be executed no matter what, which is not very efficient. Instead, we want to do this part only if the position we are currently hovering over has changed. So create a new variable called current grid position of type vector2int. Then inside the hover over object check, if the grid position equals to current grid position, it will mean that we are still hovering over the same grid position. So we don't need to execute everything else in this method, and we should exit. Good, this is it for this episode. If you have any questions or any ideas about code, please leave your comment below. If you're interested in seeing what will come out of this, please subscribe. If you want to support further, you can find my Patreon in the description. Special thank you to Andrew V. Long and TheSaltHashDo for their generous support. With best regards, see you in the next episode.